Yes, I am getting more political. I think that is, it's interesting to hear you state it so plainly, because I think it's something that I wrestled with in the writing of this book specifically.
Okay.
Um, some of it is events in the world, and specifically in the U.S. Um, we have, shortly after Donald Trump was elected president of this country, uh, it became difficult to write speculative fiction in the same way for me. It just felt like, what am I doing? On some level, I think my stories were these kinds of emotional or metaphysical thought experiments, very often, just that were taking place in a world that felt a little bit like um, I had filtered out some of the real world so that I could focus on, the story itself without the outside world impinging on the story. And for it just, that didn't feel like, it felt wrong to do it starting, basically post Trump. And it's not so much a conscious decision as it just feels right viscerally, and then it comes out in the writing, I think. It's a really good question. I don't differentiate either. I say at any phase. I mean, if roughly speaking, there's a conception phase where you just have the initial idea, and I get very excited about, oh, this would be something. Either it's an interesting framing device, or it's an interesting voice, or the language is interesting. So there's a conception phase, and then the difficult part of, oh, how am I actually going to execute? Um, I would say neither before nor during do I ever think about, oh, this is going to be a speculative story, whereas this is less so. I think um, it's so going back to my previous answer, I may have when I referred to writing speculative fiction, that isn't actually how I think about it. I guess it's just more the idea of that I had I think partly from the reaction of readers, but also internally had felt that I had at times been trying to almost not avoid topics, but I had not explicitly written, for instance, about my parents' immigrant backgrounds, or my ethnicity, or race, racial relations in America or in the world. I had not um, I had not actually engaged with that in a very open way. And I wondered why that was happening. And I actually had some readers ask me, why do you sort of code things, or why are you sort of, it's clear you're writing about, say, the immigrant experience, but you're doing it in a way that feels like it's almost cloaked in genre. Why are you doing that? And so I think, now I'm sort of re-answering your first question, but basically, I think it became much harder for me to have a good answer. I couldn't really justify why I wasn't being more explicit about what I really cared about. So starting with Interior Chinatown, or Chinatown Interior, I was really trying to find a fusion between the way I write and what I wanted to write about, and meld those together. So to go to Thomas's question, I think I'm always looking for the sentences that excite me, and often those sentences that excite me, they do so because they feel like they're almost in a different language, and those tend to pull me into some kind of genre, or into a sort of a weird way, a weird lens, right? And that's how I think about it, on the sentence and concept level. in 1965, there was a law, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, that came shortly after the Civil Rights Act, you know, the year after. But this law basically ended national racial quotas in the US. Before that, there was only X number of people that could come every year from certain countries. And after that, we had the so-called brain drain, which was this sort of explosion of immigrants from countries where, you know, and my dad was one of those people. He was an engineering student who got a scholarship to go study in Mississippi. And there were, you know, lots of sort of other scientists and doctors and engineers and other sort of fields too, I think, but it seemed like a lot of technical students came. And so there was this, you know, starting in the 60s and 70s, a generation of Asian Americans, of people basically, you know, my cohort and generation, who were raised here, as Americans, right? I mean, I that's what I am. I was born here. You know, English was not my first language, but it is my primary language, and sadly now it's basically my only language. And having this specific experience, I wanted to write about, you know, through the lens of that experience, which is that in America, as you know, in American news, when you hear about racial relations, it's largely about the white, you know, white people and black people, and it's largely a kind of dialogue about what are these, you know, the history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of oppression of Black Americans over the last 400 years, and that is obviously the dominant and very important story to, you know, the essential story of understanding race in America. For an Asian American in my position, sometimes it feels like that story crowds out the other stories, you know, that there are Native Americans, obviously, and Latinx Americans, and you know, that there's a whole, and also even putting aside just the actual groups, that the story of race in America is much more complex than just white people and black people. And although that's acknowledged by a lot of people and lots of work has been written about it, you know, I wanted to sort of, you know, apply the sort of, as you said, sort of craft that I had from television and from speculative storytelling, and do something with the form that might yield a new angle into what does it look like if you are an Asian American in this country, and you and the metaphor that I hit on is that it feels like you're a minor character, you know. So you are a background character in a story that's really largely not about you. And so I set it in this world of so-called black and white. I mean, I literally just titled it Black and White, which actually there are American movies and shows that basically are that. So it's a black cop and a white cop, and the show's all about them. And Willis Wu, who's my protagonist, is essentially the kind of guy who doesn't get to talk. He's just either supposed to deliver food or do kung fu, which are the sort of stereotypical roles that Asian Americans have had to sort of be represented by for many decades. That's a great frame for a question. It is, it's the feeling that to some extent of a secondary, almost like a second-class racism. That, for instance, you can make a joke about an Asian American or like the Chinese in America in a way that if you made the same joke about, for instance, black people, it would probably generate a lot more sort of controversy. Or at least that's how it's been. Maybe things have changed significantly in the last few years, but I think it's the feeling for me anyway. And I hope I'm not reducing Kathy Park Hong's book to just this idea, But for me, part of that phrase, minor feelings, is this idea that as an Asian American experience racism and discrimination, you almost don't know what to do with it, because it's not, you don't have as much of a public model. You know, you don't learn about it in the history books when we're taught those things in school. So it almost feels very private and idiosyncratic. And it's not until later that you maybe go to university and you say, oh, you take a course and you realize, oh, there's other people that sort of feel this or have experienced racism in the same way I have. So the minorness is actually part of the hurt in a way. You know, it's I think the other minorness part of it is that, you know, even if and they have been, if Black Americans have been oppressed, it's still, that's the major problem, really, right? And so, and I think the idea that it doesn't translate, you know, back to what you were talking about, you know, from America to France, you know, that it doesn't, the racism problem isn't the same. It ties to this idea, right, of American exceptionalism, that America was supposed to be different, that while there was there was a country, you know, in France before, and there's a French people and a French nation that has existed for much longer. In America, it's supposed to be this brand new experiment that de Tocqueville was writing about not too long ago, right? And in theory, it's not a white country, except of course it is a white country, you know, and it's very much a default white country. And so I think for me, that's the part of it that probably doesn't translate as much, is that there are, at least for immigrants like my parents, a belief that when they came here, it was supposed to be different. You know, this country was supposed to welcome them, and then the reality being so much different from sort of the ideal. It's a very important question. I think there is a connection between, you know, literal screen representation and the real world, but also just our mental representations, you know, and how we think of ourselves. And it does tie to typecasting. You know, on a very basic level, if I think the mass media is so powerful, if you've never seen an Asian in a certain kind of role, as an American, that has to have an effect on whether or not that face looks American to you, what American means. You know, does it mean just white? Does it mean white and black, or white, black, and brown? You know, for me, the invisibility of Asian faces in American mass media is tied to the fact that Asian Americans tend to be overlooked in the conversation of what it means to be an American, when in fact, Asians have been in America for close to 200 years at this point, and actually, you know, have played important parts in some of American history. It's very easy to just sort of slice out those parts of it, because it makes for a cleaner story if you make it the story of white and black in America. But I think to me it extends, and it hurts it hurts everyone. It hurts white Americans and black Americans and Americans of all races to have these models reinforced. It becomes a kind of feedback loop where the story on screen represents a model of who we think we are, and then we put that back out into the world. And then that, of course, tells Hollywood, we'll make more of that, because it reinforces itself. And I think that's the damage, not just to any specific minority group, but to everybody. I did watch a lot. Yeah, I watched a lot when I have 2 kids now, and they're almost teenagers. But so about 10 years ago, when they were babies, I spent a lot of hours just basically, you know, trying to get them to sleep. And the one thing you can count on, I don't know if this is true in France, but in America, you can turn on the TV anytime, day or night, and you could find Law and Order somewhere on the air. And it's it's
Not the
incredible.
case in France.
Okay. And it's such an easy thing to just let it end, and then the next one starts. And when you have hours where you're just sort of stuck holding a baby, it just, the pattern kind of got imprinted on my brain. And it's not just that show. I mean, I think it's this kind of cop procedural show that became an easy form and a container for a lot of the things you're talking about, which is going back to Magnum PI, the sort of cop procedural show dates back almost to the beginning of, maybe not the beginning of TV, but pretty close. The 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s had their versions of these shows. And what they have in common is they have a familiarity for the viewer. The viewer knows it's one version of our American monomyth. There's a lone person, usually a man, who has a problem to solve and will solve it using his wits and his gun, and probably along the way will also make someone fall in love with him, and sort of that's the pattern. And he solves the crime every week. And so that became a very sort of easy way in for viewers, or for what I hope would be viewers of those shows, to also recognize the pattern in this book. Yeah, I learned a couple of things. I suppose one thing I learned is how to try to think in pictures instead of words, because like you said, I'm very much interested in form, and I'm interested in words. And there were moments when I first joined a writer's room for Westworld where I felt like I didn't know really what was going on. And I would pitch things that were essentially ideas, or they were almost like sort of poetic metaphors that you would, when you'd say, well, that's lovely, but how am I going to film that with a camera and real people? And so that was one sort of thing. And I guess the other thing is really I think the craft of it, putting together something that ultimately has to have a shape that I think a novel doesn't have to have a prescribed shape in the same way. Of course, you want the novel to have some kind of, well, maybe you don't, but that's just it, right? I mean, I couldn't say about any novel, well, this is going to happen. But with TV, on some level, even the most sort of experimental TV is still going to end after, a certain amount of time and have certain story beats that take place. So, yeah, those are sort of the big two takeaways. And I also just learned that, as much as it was, it's fun to think of ideas, actually seeing it through all the way to the end product, that is a incredibly laborious process that, it takes a lot of really technically skilled people to do, but it's not as fun as just writing a book. Yeah, I don't, that's a good question. I don't know if you have any more liberty. I think that's a slightly different form. I think my sort of naive idea of writing a movie is that, it's closer to writing your own book, because you can go off, write the movie, give it to the studio, and of course they'll change it, but you got to write it. Whereas TV, from the beginning, it's always a very collaborative process. You have a writer's room, producers, but actually it's a little bit, in America anyway, the reverse. In a movie, the writer will write a first draft or second draft of the script, but at some point the director and the studio will pretty much take it away, and and they'll rewrite it, and probably the star will rewrite it too. You know, this is I don't know that it always happens like this, but whereas in TV, it's considered more of a writer's medium where you actually have some control over what is going to come out. I would say in both of them, there's certain things where they're looking for, there's a certain amount of tolerance for experimentation, depending on what network you're on or what studio, but there's a ratio of how much familiarity to completely new stuff there is. People will only tolerate so much before they're just like, well, we can't release, you know, this is people won't watch a 2-hour art film at the Cineplex. I mean, they will in the right, you know, sort of context, but Warner Brothers is not going to release your sort of 2-hour tone poem, you know, like that's not going to happen. So. Well, I'm currently adapting a couple of my own things, a story and a novel, including Interior Chinatown for TV. I can't talk specifically about who's doing it, but that's my adventure for the moment, is trying to now see if I can figure out how to translate this into the screen. In a nutshell, it really made me appreciate, you know, how much I had taken for granted. You know, it's truly sort of humbling, and you know, as a parent, but also just as someone in the world, it's sort of terrifying how quickly it felt like things were starting to unravel. And at least in the U.S. here, it still feels like that. And it's really humbling to see how much the rest of the world, most of the world, could actually get their act together, and how America is still, you know, especially our, you know, our federal government, among other things, but even culturally, I think there's just a lot of segments of the U.S. population that just don't seem to fully grasp what most people in the world were able to grasp, which is that we had to pull together and do the right thing. And while it's not entirely shocking, given the state of our country before the pandemic, it's still really unsettling. And it makes, you know, it's just made my wife and I really think about how to move forward from here, and how to raise our kids in a world where, you know, I don't know, you know, I just don't feel like I know much about what's next.